Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about annotations, which are an important part of doing research and particularly taking notes. Shortly in the future, I am going to be making and posting a video about research notes specifically, but annotations are not necessarily the same as research notes, but they're a useful way of remembering particular important pieces of information from something that you're reading. So there's a lot of ways of approaching annotation, because basically this is just marking up something that you're reading to draw your attention to the important pieces of information, to remind yourself what's crucial, to remind yourself of connections that you've made with other things that you've been reading, or to pose questions for yourself or for the text. So, given that annotation is that sort of very general thing where there's a lot of potential ways of approaching it, let's start by talking about what the purpose of annotation is in some more depth, and then talk about how you do it. So, the reason that you want to annotate things, there have been a number of studies that have shown that when you actually write something by hand, you're much more likely to remember it, even if you never go back and reread those notes. This is also why it's a good reason to take notes by hand in class rather than typing. This is one of the reasons it's good to take notes by hand in class rather than typing things out. Because when you physically write something down, you're more likely to remember it. And so one thing that people often do with annotations is they will write in the margins of books. Now, if you are one of those people who believes that books are sacred objects that should not be defaced with writing or underlining or highlighting or dog-earing pages or things like that, you have a problem with annotation. Annotation throws up some major challenges for you, but I would suggest, unless you're dealing with something like a first edition or a signed first edition or something like that of a major work, unless you're dealing with a book that is an antique and is worth a lot of money, get over that concern about writing in books, especially if you're taking university courses. Write in your books. This is one of the most important ways of remembering important information. So, you can also do this if you like print out essays or things like this. And you can if you're really, really paranoid about it, and again, I would say get over it, because it's so much more important to learn the information than it is to have pristine books. If you're really, really paranoid about it, you can make photocopies, but that's a lot of wasted paper, and I don't recommend it. Anyway, moving on from that. So, why do it? What kinds of things are you looking for when you annotate? Well, so again, this is about helping yourself remember. And part of that helping yourself remember is the act of physically marking something, which studies by education theorists, cognitive scientists, whatever it is, have shown is one way of helping yourself remember, even if you never go back and reread those notes. So that's one thing. The other thing is this gives you a visual record of important pieces of information in that text, which means that when you go back to that book or that article or whatever it is to write whatever paper you're going to write, you have that information marked. This is especially useful later on. Like if you're in, say, a first year composition course and you've got 4 articles that you're using for research over 3 weeks to write a paper, you're probably not going to have that much trouble remembering. But later on, when you work on when you work on projects over extended periods of time and you incorporate a lot of sources, having that visual record of what's important and what you were thinking about as you were doing the research becomes really, really useful. So, for instance, I'm currently working on my second book, and I'm using a lot of the books, a lot of the articles, a lot of the sources that I had used for research for my first book. Some of which I first read 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I can't reasonably expect myself to remember all that. But because I've marked important passages and taken research notes, I can go back to those books that I read 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago and still find the information that I need from those books. So that's the other important thing with annotation, is that it gives you a long-term record of the information that's important from that source. So what specifically are you looking for with annotation? Well, to a certain extent, it really depends on the project that you're doing and what kinds of information you want to get from a source. But generally speaking, if there's a thesis, that's something you probably want to mark. And most scholarly books or articles are going to have a thesis. You may want to mark key points from the argument, key ideas, main claims, things like that. And then you want to think about what specific data or information is relevant to the argument that you're going to be making. And you want to mark those things. And I'll talk more about that in the video on research notes, because that is one of the things that you want to be considering and taking note of as you're doing your research notes, is how am I going to use this? So those are the kinds of things that you're really looking for annotations, is a thesis, main ideas, and important points that are relevant to your interest. So how do you do annotations? Well, again, there's a lot of different ways, and this is a very highly personalized process. So I'll tell you about some of the things that I do, some of the things that I don't do, but that other people do. But basically, annotation is a system of marking up research sources in a way that is going to be meaningful for you as a reader. So what I tend to do for a general section that I think is important, I will put little sort of L-shaped L-shaped, I guess, upside down L for the top, regular L for the bottom, sort of brackets at the top and the bottom of that section. So that, to me, is a visual marker that this general section is useful or important for the research that I'm doing. And then for individual sentences or portions of that section that are especially useful or that I think I'm really likely to quote in whatever I'm writing, I'll put those in parentheses. So that's my major system for marking things that are important, and then things that I think are likely to be quoted, or things that are really useful. Now, if something is super important or super important, I may put exclamation marks, either 1 or 3, depending on its importance, in the margin. And that exclamation mark or 3 exclamation marks, again, signals to me when I go back and look at that this is an important piece. This is something I really want to take into account when I'm writing whatever it is I'm writing from that source. The other thing that I consistently do is I will dog-ear the pages. So a lot of people, so like you can see right there, that's a pretty substantial dog-ear. A lot of times I'll do smaller ones just in the corner there, but sometimes what I'll do is actually a variety of dog-ears, where I'll do small dog-ears for things that I think are important but not crucial, and then sort of large third of a page maybe dog-ears for things that I think are really significant and I want to make sure I come back to that. Now, the reason I do dog-ear, and I understand a lot of people don't like dog-earing books, that's perfectly legitimate. I don't have a problem if you don't like doing that. Sometimes people will put colored sticky notes in it. Some people some people just use sticky notes in general. Some people will use different colored sticky notes to indicate different types of information. That's perfectly fine. If you want to do that and you have a bunch of sticky notes of different colors, that's a good system. And I've done that with library books, and I've done that with other people's books, where I will put sticky notes in them to indicate important sections, because I don't want to dog-ear other people's pages. I will dog-ear my pages because, fuck it, they're my books. But by giving yourself that sort of differentiation, so the good thing about dog-earing, or indeed putting sticky notes or something like that, is that it's very easy to return to the particular pages that you want to draw from. So I can very easily find a particular piece of information going from my research notes, where I mark the pages anyway, to the actual document. Like, I don't necessarily have to flip around as much, because I just look for the dog-eared pages and I know that's something there. Right? I know that that's going to be something that's important. Then I just have to find the right dog ear. And again, the larger dog ears, to me, is, in my system, the larger dog ears become, this is really significant. So those are the first ones that I check. The other thing that I often do, and I probably don't do this as much as I should, is I will write comments or questions in the margin. So the things that I often comment on, if I have a connection to another text, or if there's something specific that I want to remember about this. So say, for instance, I'm reading a book by Wendy Brown, and something that she says reminds me of something that Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have said elsewhere. I may write that link, Hart and Negri, and just put that as my margin comment to remind myself of that connection. I may also ask questions or point out shortcomings in a particular argument if there's something that I think is wrong. I did this a lot with Immanuel Velikovsky's book Oedipus and Akhenaten, because there's a lot of shortfalls in that book, and I made a video about that for my other channel. If you're interested in seeing that, you should be seeing a link pop up in the top corner now. But these are really useful because beyond just the marks that you use, and again, you want to develop a system of marking up your books that's going to consistently make sense to you. But beyond those marks, writing questions, writing connections, writing thoughts is a really useful way of recording why you thought that particular passage was important. So, some other techniques that people use for annotation, because again, that's my particular system that I use, but there's a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of ways to personalize this. One of the most common things that people do is highlighting. I don't like highlighting. I don't own highlighters, so I don't do it, but a lot of people do. And some people, like with the sticky notes, will use different colored highlighting to indicate different types of information. So key arguments might be highlighted in yellow. Useful information that you think you want to quote might be highlighted in green. Things that you think are maybe questionable, things that are maybe unreliable, or things that you might want to push back against might be highlighted in pink. So you can develop your own sort of color-coded system if you want to use highlighting. One thing I will say about highlighting, I've seen the argument made that often people get sort of highlighter happy and will just highlight massive portions of books to the point where where they've highlighted so much of the book that it's really not useful for narrowing down their research. I can see that as a risk with any kind of annotation, but it is something that maybe you want to keep in mind with highlighting because it is so easy to do. Other things people do, underlining is a big one. putting things like stars or smiley faces or question marks. Again, exclamation marks I use. That's a fairly common one. Any sort of technique for marking the text can be really, really useful for you in terms of reminding yourself of what information matters here. You can also, if you're so inclined, use editor's marks. And on the screen right now, you should be seeing as sort of an image of some editor's marks that are very common. That may or may not be all that useful to you, depending on how familiar you are with them and what kinds of information you want to mark. Some editor's marks may be more useful than others, but again, you want to develop your own system that's going to make sense to you for highlighting or reminding yourself about the key argument that's being made here, the main points, and the evidence or the information or the arguments that are going to be useful to you specifically.